There's a photograph that went viral a few years back. A rocky hillside somewhere in northern India with all grays, browns, and shadows. The caption asked people to find the animal hiding right in plain sight. And so, cue thousands of people staring, zooming, adjusting their screen brightness, etc. And yet, even with the modern convenience of having a totally still image, which you can manipulate in any way your heart desires, most of us were not able to find it. But what if I told you that right there, in the middle of the screen, is a 100+ pound apex predator? And even with me telling you this, unless you've seen this picture before, you probably still cannot find the animal. But the really crazy part is that this animal that you presumably just missed is not even close to being nature's best camouflager. And yet, it still might as well be a wizard for as far as we're concerned. And that's the thing about camouflage. It's not magic, but it might as well be. Because when it's done right, your brain just refuses to accept what's actually there. You could be staring directly at something, and your eyes will insist that it's just a leaf. Meanwhile, said leaf is currently deciding whether or not to eat you. And so unsurprisingly, humans have been trying to crack this code for ages. We've got military camouflage, ghillie suits, face paint, we've thrown everything at it. And we've gotten pretty decent, sure. But the truth is, we're still playing catch up to nature. And I mean that in every sense of the expression. I mean, I'm talking about insects that cosplay as flowers to commit murder, cephalopods that can shapeshift into different animals depending on their mood, and amphibians that have become transparent. And that's barely scratching the surface. But before we get into the truly bonkers stuff, let's establish a baseline with an animal most people have actually heard of, the one from the image I showed you before. And here it is again, in full glory. Now what you're looking at is a snow leopard. Standing about half a meter, or 22 inches at the shoulder, and stretching up to 1.5 meters, or 5 feet long when not including the tail, with the tail itself being nearly as long as the body, snow leopards aren't exactly small, but they're not exactly huge either. But don't let that fool you, because what they lack in size, they make up for in pure stealth, which should probably be pretty apparent by now. Now, they essentially employ two different stealth technologies, if you will, with the first, most obvious type being color matching. Their fur is a smoky gray color, which generally mirrors their chosen alpine environment quite well. And so obviously that helps a good deal. But the true magic comes from the dark rosettes and spots on its fur, which kind of look like someone took a paintbrush and just went to town. But here's the thing, those patterns are not random at all. You see, those rosettes serve to break up the snow leopard's outline, and does so effectively that even if you're looking right at one, your brain just sees rocks and snow instead of big murder cat. And this is something called disruptive coloration, and it's one of the oldest tricks in the book, yet also one of the most effective. Those dark spots and rosettes of a snow leopard help break up its body outline against the rocky terrain by approximating natural shadow or crack patterns in the environment, and essentially making the cat's shape itself harder to detect, making the leopard basically vanish into the landscape. And lab tests back this up, with objects that have disruptive coloration requiring longer time to see than the solid colored controls, concealing not only location, but also identity. Disruptive coloration is also particularly useful compared to pure color matching in animals who frequent different environments or environments which heavily change in appearance. Now, unlike a lot of the flashier examples we'll get to, snow leopards cannot change their appearance or do anything too fancy. They're stuck with essentially the same outfit their whole lives. But when said outfit makes you nearly invisible to both prey and predators in one of the harshest environments on Earth, who needs more than one? These quote-unquote ghosts of the mountains, which yes, is an actual nickname of theirs, have been stalking wild sheep and goats for millennia, using nothing but patience, excellent camouflage, and the ability to leap up to 15 meters or 50 feet in a single bound. Oh, and some ridiculously sharp teeth and claws as well. And they do all of this successfully while operating in some of the most extreme real estate locations on the planet. You see, in the Himalayas, snow leopards typically range between 3,000 and 5,400 meters, or roughly 10,000 to 17,700 feet. And at those altitudes, the temperature is brutal, food is scarce, and the air is thin, which at the peak is only 50% of normal atmospheric pressure, meaning for every breath you take, you only get half as much oxygen as normal. Yeah. Which is why it's so important that their hunting strategy is effective to conserve energy. And lo and behold, it is, with analysis showing that cliff-dwelling ungulates, like the Baral and Himalayan tar, make up roughly 50% of their diet. In other words, they specialize in animals that near no other predator can reach. And honestly, this formidability makes complete sense, seeing that despite their name, the snow leopard's closest relative is actually the tiger, with it being its sister species, and vice versa. However, with all of this said, despite being apex predators perfectly adapted to their environment, there are unfortunately only less than 10,000 mature individuals, and the population is only expected to decrease, being caught between habitat loss, declining prey populations, poaching for fur, and killing by farmers and herders. So if you ever do spot one, consider yourself exceptionally lucky, as you're looking at one of the rarest big cats on Earth. Alright, so the snow leopard is pretty good at blending in, but what if instead of just matching your environment, you just became your environment? Well, that's exactly what our friend the leafy sea dragon, or Ficodurus equus if you're feeling fancy, was thinking. Found exclusively along the southern and western coast of Australia, these things are related to seahorses, but look like someone crossbred a seahorse with a salad. Seaweed salad, to be specific. They're about 20 to 24 centimeters, or 7 to 9 inches long, and covered head to tail in elaborate leaf-shaped appendages that sprout from just every part of their body. Face, spine, tail, even their freaking cheeks, all decorated with these flowing appendages that look exactly like torn strands of seaweed. But here's the kicker, these aren't fins. In fact, they don't help with swimming at all, rather the opposite if anything, and have no physical functional purpose, being pure decoration, so to speak. The actual propulsion comes from two nearly transparent fins, a pair of pectoral fins on the neck and a dorsal fin on the back, which are so thin that you can barely see them even when you're looking right at them. And these fins ripple just barely enough to drift the sea dragon through the water at an agonizingly slow pace, a pace akin to a piece of kelp caught in a lazy current. So from a distance, it doesn't look like an animal at all, rather just some floating debris. But that, my friends, is exactly the point. This isn't just background matching, this is mimesis, or mimicry, or masquerade, which describes a camouflage technique whereby the animal specifically resembles an inedible or uninteresting object. And that's exactly what the leafy sea dragon has evolved to imitate, an uninteresting object in its environment, seaweed. They hover over sand patches, seagrass, and kelp-covered rocks, up to depths of 50 meters or roughly 165 feet, feeding on tiny mysid shrimp and plankton, being completely unbothered because nothing recognizes them as food. And here's where it gets even weirder. Leafy sea dragons don't even have teeth, or a proper stomach, so they feed almost continuously, using suction to pull in the small creatures through their elongated snout, which then get processed through their digestive tract basically in real time. So basically they're just permanently snacking while drifting through kelp beds, all the while looking like animated salad with a vacuum. And these aren't the only oddities in the ocean, making you wish there was a way you could explore it from the safety of your own home, which speaking of, there is. Let me introduce you to Fishing Clash, the sponsor of today's video, and just about the only way you can catch sharks, extinct animals like the Basilosaurus, and many other rarities, all the while not having to leave the comfort of the couch. In fact, you can collect just about any fish or watery creature you can imagine, extinct or living, while also assembling a lineup of lures, rods, and equipment. Not convinced yet? Well, if you're a nature and animal lover, then listen to this. It's got a vast amount of detailed ecosystems to explore, unique fish species specific to their real-life habitats, and virtual events that promote sustainability and conservation, allowing you to both have a great time and make the world a better place. And if you worry that Fishing Clash may suffer from some of the normal pitfalls of regular app games, then take solace in some of these facts. First, despite a 7-year run, it is still updating on the regular. Second, it allows you to play the game both casually or competitively, depending on what you're looking for. And third, everything is unlockable through free play. And clearly something is cooking here, as 50 million people are already playing the game, which mind you, would make Fishing Clash the 30th largest country on the planet. So join the nation. If you're interested, download the game using my link in the description box, or scan the QR code displayed on the screen. Use my special gift code, LivingZoo, to claim a $20 value reward, including unique avatar, for free. And now, back to the video. And to add on to their quirkiness, they also reproduce in quite the unusual manner. The female produces up to 250 eggs, which are bright pink, and then transfers them onto a specialized brood patch on the male's tail. This patch is highly vascularized, meaning it's got a lot of blood vessels running through it to supply oxygen to the developing embryos. The male then carries these eggs, instead of the female, for about 9 weeks, depending on the water conditions, essentially becoming a living incubator. And when the babies finally hatch, they come out as these tiny little miniatures of the adults, already sporting their own leafy appendages. So male pregnancy is quite odd, but to be honest with you, that really doesn't cut it when it comes to the weirdest birthing processes in the animal kingdom, which I just made a video about, by the way, so if you haven't seen that, go check it out. Now, unlike the snow leopard, these guys can actually shift their color a bit depending on diet, age, and stress, but nothing incredibly drastic, generally staying some hue of brown, yellow, or reddish. And it happens over time, so no rapid color changes, no fancy tricks, just pretty much a fish committed so hard to the I'm a plant bit that it can't even swim properly anymore. But guess what? It works. I mean, they're listed as least concern by the IUCN, so while they might look fragile, absurd, and move as fast as paint dries, these living salads are doing just fine. Okay, so we've covered look like rocks, and now we've covered look like seaweed. But what if we took it a step further? What if instead of looking like something, you just didn't look like anything? In other words, what if you became see-through? Meet the glass frog. And yes, it's exactly what it sounds like. Found in the rainforests of Central and South America, these tiny amphibians range from just about 20 millimeters, or roughly 0.8 inches long, to about 80 millimeters, or 3 inches, and are basically nature's permanently X-rayed animal. Flip one over, and you can see its heart beating, its liver doing liver things, and food moving through its intestines, all with no dissection being required. Just look. Now, transparency is actually pretty common. In the water, that is. Jellyfish, many larval animals, lots of ocean critters pull it off. But on land, that's a whole different ballgame, chiefly because light behaves differently in air than in water. And most terrestrial animals are also full of opaque stuff like bones and blood. Bright red, highly visible blood at that. So how do glass frogs pull off transparency when they've got a full circulatory system full of light-absorbing red blood cells? And here's where things get odd, to say the least. You see, when glass frogs sleep, which they do during the day while clinging to the underside of leaves, they hide their blood. And yes, you heard that right. They literally hide their blood. In a 2022 study, researchers discovered that resting glass frogs can remove nearly 90% of their red blood cells from circulation, pushing them into their liver, which contains reflective guanine cells that hide the blood from light, effectively making them 2 to 3 times more transparent than when they are active. Now, let me repeat that, because it does bear some repeating. These frogs store their blood in their liver to become invisible. Well, less visible. And somehow, despite concentrating almost all of their red blood cells in one organ, they survive. As in any other animal, this would cause massive fatal blood clots, among many other bad things. As when red blood cells congregate and are stagnant, coagulation processes are triggered, hence the massive blood clot risk. And yet with glass frogs, they don't, at all. And this obviously got scientists pretty interested, especially medical researchers, particularly because if we could figure out the mechanism, it might lead to breakthroughs in clotting disorders and strokes in humans. But the invisibility trick isn't just about hiding blood. You see, their translucent limbs create edge diffusion, where the outline of the frog's body becomes harder to detect against leaves because there's no sharp contrast. And then in addition, their transparent skin was found to offer more distinct color changes than if they controlled the color in their skin through pigmentation, essentially making their transparency a much more versatile tool. And it clearly is very effective, as one study found that compared to opaque frogs, translucent frogs were much less visible and were attacked by birds significantly less often. And so during the day, they roost on leaf undersides with their green backs facing up, thus matching the foliage, while their more transparent underside masks their outline. So it's basically a 2-layer camouflage system. The top looks like a leaf, and the bottom doesn't look like much of anything besides what they're on top of. And because they're arboreal amphibians living along forest streams, their whole life cycle is basically adapted to this lifestyle. Males often call, in other words ribbit, from leaves above running water, and many species lay clutches of eggs on the same leaves. And the eggs themselves are often translucent or at least semi-translucent, thus continuing the theme. And if this wasn't all weird enough, some glass frog species will not only be translucent to regular light, but on the flip side will reflect near infrared light, which scientists think may help with thermoregulation and possibly infrared camouflage, making their temperature profile more similar to that of the background. So in other words, they're purposely invisible to some sorts of light and specifically visible to others, which is pretty ingenious. So yeah, glass frogs are essentially teaching us medicine while simultaneously being tiny transparent ninjas that sleep on leaves. Not too bad for something the size of a quarter. And clearly it's working out pretty well for them, seeing that there are, 150 plus species of them. So we've covered the art of stealth through color, pattern, shape, and now even invisibility. But what if the secret isn't what you look like, but rather what you do? Or more accurately, what you don't do? Enter the patoo, a family of birds that has mastered the way of becoming a stick by the simple strategy of never, ever moving. Found in Central and South America, these birds can be surprisingly big, with the largest species, the great patoo, measuring about 20 to 60 centimeters, or roughly 19 to 24 inches long, with a wingspan just under a meter, or 31 inches, and weighing anywhere from a kilo to about 2 pounds. But despite being roughly the size of a medium-sized hawk, you could walk right past one and never notice it. During the day, the patoo picks a stump, stands upright, positions its head at just the right angle, and goes full Squid Game statue mode. To add on to this, its feathers are mottled white, gray, brown, essentially matching tree bark almost perfectly, and its short, wide beak basically disappears into the outline. And so, this coloration no doubt helps immensely, but the real magic here is really behavioral, as the patoo doesn't just look like a branch, it acts like one patoo. Get it? It doesn't fly, doesn't fidget, doesn't scratch, instead adopting a freeze pose throughout the day, and it angles itself in such a way that it naturally matches the stump or branch that it's perched on. However, the species does have a downside, which is that because the species is primarily nocturnal, it possesses large black eyes that are reflective, making them highly visible to predators if they are open. And though it does have a perfect stump impression, it can't just keep its eyes permanently closed, as then it would lose awareness of its surroundings, and thus potential dangers. And so, the patoo has evolved a very clever adaptation, which is that its upper eyelids actually have small notches or slits built right in, allowing the bird to keep its eyes closed, but still be able to see enough so that it can sense movement in its surroundings. So all in all, the patoo basically combines looking like a stub of wood with acting like a stub of wood. And this lovely strategy actually has a name, cryptic behavior, and is basically when an organism modifies its behavior such that it makes it harder to detect. But obviously sitting still forever is not viable, so at night is when the act drops. At this point, the patoo launches itself off its perch, snatching up insects mid-flight with its huge mouth, and then glides right back to the same spot to resume its artistic impression of wood, sometimes using the exact same perch for weeks or even months. So while other birds are building elaborate nests, doing complicated dance and songs, or getting frisky with researchers' heads, the patoo just stands there and lets the world forget about it. But if you thought this bird's play stick routine was impressive, let me introduce you to an animal that took the concept and ran with it. In other words, the leaf-tailed geckos, and especially the species Uroplatus fantasticus, also known as the satanic leaf-tailed gecko for probably self-apparent reasons. And this guy might be the most perfectly camouflaged reptile on the entire planet. Found only in Madagascar, endemic to the island and nowhere else, these geckos are small, around 9 centimeters or 3.5 inches long, even when including the tail. But even with their less than large status, their body is absolutely packed with detail, camouflage detailing. Their tail is shaped exactly like a curled dried leaf, complete with fake veins, brown edges, and even spots that mimic decay. Their body is textured to look like bark. They've got jagged skin fringes along their sides and legs, which all serve to do, you guessed it, break up their outline, causing them to blend in perfectly with the background. And they take the art of deception even further by flattening their body against the leaves to reduce their body's shadow, and sometimes voluntarily breaking off their tail in order to trick a predator. So, if you ever find yourself in Madagascar and you think you see a dead leaf on a branch, maybe don't touch it, because there's a non-zero chance it has teeth. So apparently, evolving to look like your environment is a pretty nifty tool. But what if you could just build your own environmental costume? What if nature gave you the ability to hot glue the world around you directly onto your body? Well, that's exactly what the decorator crab does. And yes, that's its real name. Found in oceans worldwide, these crabs have taken camouflage in a completely different direction. Instead of waiting millions of years for evolution to give them the right colors and patterns, they just go, recycling. Decorator crabs will just go around picking up stuff off the ground, or rather, ocean floor. Algae, anemones, you name it, and they'll pick it, and then go on to attach it to their exoskeleton using tiny hooked hair that adorn their body, called setae. So they're basically doing underwater arts and craft, except the craft project's goal is don't get eaten. And they're not random about what they pick up either. Studies show that decorator crabs actively choose materials that match their surroundings. For instance, if they're moved to a new environment, they will completely strip off their old decorations and start over with quote-unquote locally sourced material, very sustainable of them. And this isn't a one-time thing. As they grow and molt, they have to redo the whole outfit, with some species also only showing decorating behavior at certain points in their life cycle. And then again, some species even take their defense a step further by selecting specific material like anemones to ward off predators, which not only provide camouflage, but also sting would-be predators, or potentially track Nemo. And interestingly enough, they seem to have some sort of understanding of what is deadly and where they are most vulnerable, as some decorator crabs have been observed putting noxious algae only in the most exposed parts of its body, which honestly has some pretty interesting ramifications. And this strategy of self-decorating for camouflage is unsurprisingly called self-decoration, and it's one of the most labor-intensive forms of camouflage out there, if not the most. But it's also one of the most flexible. Can't evolve fast enough to keep up with your environment? No prob, just change your outfit. It's pretty much the ultimate adaptive strategy, and it requires a level of tool use and adaptive decision-making, which puts these crabs in pretty exclusive company. Well, at least for crabs. Now at this point, you're probably thinking that camouflage is generally for defense, and if you were, you'd generally be right. But of course, the flip side is also true, such as with the snow leopard that I talked about earlier. But perhaps there's no better example of offensive camouflage than this guy. And no, I'm not talking about the flower. Look a bit closer. There you go. Meet the orchid mantis, Hymenopus coronatus, and prepare to have your mind blown. Found in the rainforest of Southeast Asia, female orchid mantises can grow up to 7 centimeters, or roughly 2.5 inches, while the males are much smaller, barely reaching half the female size, if that. And yeah, that's a big difference, showing one of the biggest examples of sexual dimorphism among mantises, likely being an adaptation for what is essentially niche partitioning, whereupon the female targets larger prey, while the males go after smaller ones. And they don't just look like flowers in general, but rather specific flowers, orchid flowers to be exact, hence the name. And with their petal-shaped limbs, white, pink, or brown coloration, and the ability to sway gently like they're caught in a breeze, they look almost identical to the real thing. But here's where it gets devious. Orchid mantises don't just mimic flowers to hide them from predators, they mimic flowers to attract prey. Bees, butterflies, and other pollinators see what they think is a delicious source of nectar, and thus land by the flower, and boom, their lunch. And this, my friends, is called aggressive mimicry, and it's one of the most predatory forms of camouflage out there, as the mantis isn't just hiding its presence, it's advertising it, just in a rather diabolical way. And get this, studies have shown that orchid mantises actually attract more pollinators than the real flowers in the same area. And to the eyes of the pollinators, their body color is essentially indistinguishable from the flowers they imitate. But again, they're not just mimicking them, they're outcompeting them, which begs the question of how. Well, one study showed that certain mantises, specifically the juvenile orchid mantises, are particularly good at catching honeybees, and researchers discovered why. The juveniles emit bee-like pheromone components, specifically 3-hydroxyoctanoic acid and 10-hydroxy-E2-decanoic acid, which are the same compounds bees use to communicate. So, not only do they look like flowers, they smell like bees, and they use this to draw the honeybees in before striking, essentially acting as a double lure, visual and chemical. And if their disguise fails, no problem, because they're also incredibly fast. Like all mantises, orchid mantises strike in a fraction of a second, being able to snatch prey out of the air in the blink of an eye, with their powerful, spiked forelegs. So, even if you do figure out the trick, if you're close enough to have done so, you're probably doomed. And to me, the orchid mantis is basically like if nature asked, what if we made a flower, but evil? But on the flip side, what if we can just pretend to be evil to scare everything off? What if, instead of hiding, you just pretend to be someone scarier? And guess what? This is actually a real strategy, and it's called Batesian mimicry, named after naturalist Henry Walter Bates. And it's when a relatively harmless species evolves to look like a more dangerous one, banking on other animals on recognizing the warning signals and thus staying away. And it's basically one of evolution's sneakiest plays, or should I say, snakiest in this case. As the classic example, milk snakes and coral snakes. You see, coral snakes are venomous little nightmares with bright bands of red, yellow, and black. And their coloration screams, "Don't touch me, or you'll die." And most predators have learned to stay away. Milk snakes, on the other hand, are completely harmless. But some species have evolved to have almost identical color patterns, bands of red, yellow, and black, all arranged in such a way that makes them look just dangerous enough that predators think twice before attacking. Now, there are some differences in their coloration, which is why there's actually a rhyme to tell them apart. Red touches yellow, kill a fellow. Red touches black, friend of Jack. But here's the thing, and this might shock you, but predators don't know the rhyme. I know, crazy. They just see the warning colors and nope out, which is exactly what the milk snake is counting on. And we know this works because of a very interesting field experiment in evolutionary biology. And it went like this. Researchers placed 1,200 replica snakes, some with coral snake banding and some with non-mimetic patterns, in other words, non-coral snake looking like patterns, across multiple sites in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Arizona. And in areas where real coral snakes were present, the coral-banded replicas were attacked far less frequently. In North and South Carolina, where they do have real coral snakes, the ringed mimic snakes were attacked only 8.3% of the time, compared to 65.4% in allopatry areas. In other words, where coral snakes don't natively occur. And in Arizona, the numbers are similar, with the final message being very clear, which is that mimicry only works where the original actually exists, because that's where predators have learned the warning signal, and showing that it's not the color that matters, but rather who you look like. And the relationship gets even more interesting than that. You see, coral snake populations decline with increasing latitude or elevation. And so shockingly, but unshockingly, attacks on the coral-banded replicas increased as they were placed at higher altitudes. Which again goes to show that if there aren't enough real coral snakes around to maintain proper predator education, the mimics start getting attacked more often, and thus the mimicry is useless. But where the real ones occur, it's very effective. And in fact, it's so effective that coral snake mimetic coloration has evolved at least 26 separate times in different snake lineages, both in the Old World and in the New World. But with all this said, I do have to say one caveat. Remember that rhyme that everyone loves? Well, that is regionally limited and basically useless outside the southeastern United States. Even state wildlife agencies note that it's of little use in places like North Carolina and should never be used outside the US in tropical areas. where pattern variation is much, much wider. So if you're traveling, maybe don't rely on little rhymes, just don't touch the colorful danger noodles. So, moving on from nature's version of stolen valor, we're finally getting to the really weird stuff. And that's saying something. And this of course fittingly happens in the depths of our planet, the oceans. Now, imagine for a second that your problem as an animal wasn't your body standing out, but rather your shadow. And what if the solution to that was, instead of blending into the background, you turned on the lights, so to speak? Sounds odd, but it'll make sense soon. What I've just described is called counter-illumination, being found mostly in deep-sea creatures, like the firefly squid, hatchetfish, and the cookie-cutter shark. And it works like this. These animals have bioluminescent organs, called photophores. When you swim in the ocean, normally light from the surface filters down, creating a silhouette around the animals. And both prey and predators from below can spot this from miles away, figuratively. And so, evolution came up with a clever way of preventing this, by making it so that they produce their own light to match the brightness coming from above, effectively erasing the shadow caused by it by matching both the intensity and spectrum of downwelling light. The Hawaiian bobtail squid, for example, is able to fine-tune its glow to match the ambient light, either changing the shade or intensity to better camouflage itself. And we're not talking about rough approximations here. The squid is able to repeatedly change its light to reflect the changes in the light around it. And though the principle of counter-illumination works the same throughout all animals, each species have evolved different strategies. Some, like the lanternfish for example, actively modulate their light output to match changing conditions, like the Hawaiian bobtail squid. Others, like certain sharks, keep a constant light output and instead move to specific depths in order to have their glow match the background light's glow. And you might be wondering, how do they do this? Well, it turns out that many species have eye-facing photophores that scientists think act as built-in light meters, therefore providing a brightness reference for both tuning their glow and finding the right glow around them. And obviously, because of the nature of how it works, essentially hiding itself with a light above, it doesn't work everywhere in the ocean, as once you hit the true midnight zone where no light penetrates, the strategy obviously stops working. But above that, it basically acts like Harry's invisibility cloak, just powered by biochemistry instead of magic. But if quasi-invisibility seems magical, just wait until you hear about the next guy. Now, we've covered pattern-based camouflage, built-in shape-shifting, transparent bodies, behavioral tricks, aggressive mimicry, and even living lights. But what if one animal could do all of it? What if one creature looked at the entire camouflage playbook and said, yeah, I'll take the lot? Well, no need for a what if, because such a creature does actually exist. Enter the mimic octopus, Themoctopus mimicus, who is the undisputed champion of deception. First being described in 2005, which just speaks to its abilities, and found in the shallow waters of the Indo-Pacific, particularly around Indonesia, where it forages in silty or sandy areas, these octopi are fairly small, stretching up to 60 centimeters or 24 inches in total length, including its arms. But what they lack in size, they make up for in pure, unfiltered weirdness. You see, the mimic octopus doesn't just camouflage itself, it impersonates other animals. On demand, while swimming that is, in real time that is. And here's the key detail, it does this during the day, in full view of the world, actively foraging across open sand flats where there's nowhere to hide. But that's totally fine, because if you need to scare off a predator, just spread your arms wide, add some stripes, and boom, now you're suddenly a venomous lionfish. Want to glide across the seafloor unnoticed? Just flatten out, tuck in your arms, and guess what? Now you're a flatfish. Uh-oh, more danger approaching? No worries, just hold out your arms, add some color bands, and congratulations, you're now a sea snake, one of the most venomous creatures in the ocean. And this behavior is not random. The mimic octopus chooses what to impersonate based on the threat it's perceiving. It assesses the situation, picks the most effective disguise for it, and then executes. For example, in one observation, when a mimic octopus was harassed by a damselfish, it immediately presented a banded sea snake display, which is a known damselfish predator. And the really interesting part is that scientists don't believe this is instinct, rather a form of experience and learning that requires memory because it has to remember what these other animals look and move like, requires visual processing because it has to recognize the threats and decide what would scare them off, and then of course, incredible body control, because pulling off a convincing lionfish impression isn't exactly easy when you're a blob of soft tissue with no bones. But putting aside its Jimmy Neutron level of intelligence, this all begs the question of how does it actually do this? Well, mimic octopus's skin contains millions of chromatophores, tiny pigment sacs that expand and contract to change color almost instantly. And mixed in are iridophores and lucifores, which reflect and scatter light to create shimmer and brightness. And the result is that the octopus can shift from beige to striped in seconds. And by seconds, I mean hundreds of milliseconds top. Body pattern switches so fast that it happens in the time that you can blink. But here's the kicker. The mimic octopus is colorblind. Most octopuses have a single visual pigment, making them effectively monochromatic in vision. In other words, seeing the world in shades of black and gray. And yet at the same time, they achieve striking pattern and contrast changes that involve, of course, color matching. And the exact way they do this is unknown, but scientists think its skin might be light sensitive, with the chromatophores that allow them to change color also reacting to different wavelengths of light automatically. And its nervous system is perhaps even weirder. You see, octopuses generally have around 500 million neurons in total, and while it does have a central brain, about 60% of these neurons are actually distributed equally throughout its 8 arms, with each arm then being able to sense, react, and get this, make decisions independently. So while one arm is probing a crevice for food, another might be mimicking a sea snake to scare off a nearby predator, and then a third could be, just changing color to match a rock. And this ability to rapidly shift between multiple forms, depending on context, is called dynamic mimicry. And as far as we know, only the mimic octopus and its close relative, the wonderpus, can mimic multiple different organisms depending on the situation. So while there might be other species out there that we have not discovered just yet, this thing right now is in a league of its own. So with all this said, camouflage is not just about disappearing. It's about controlling what people, predators, or prey think they're seeing, be it for defense, offense, or really anything in between. And all these different strategies represent hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary refinement, each one honed by the simple fact that if you get spotted, you die, or starve. But either way, bad news. And studies back this up, as prey species with strong camouflage had increased predator search time by about 60% and reduced attack rates by 27%. And that's just the average, with masquerade specifically increasing predator search time by a whopping 300%. So yeah, camouflage works, and nature spent a long time making sure it works really, really well. So the next time you're out in nature and you feel like something's watching you but you can't find anything, there's a real chance that your hunch is right. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to check out Fishing Clash if you want to try some fishing from the safety of your own home. Link and code in the description. And until next time.